Princess Lyra stood at the edge of the royal balcony, her skin glowing with a soft blue light that brightened with her rising frustration. Below her, the grand city of Lumen sprawled across the valley, its crystal towers catching the light of both moons. She should have felt pride looking at her kingdom, but tonight she only felt isolation. Another one refused, "Your Highness," said Torrin, her royal advisor. The old Australian's skin pulsed with sympathetic amber tones. "Lord Vex of the Southern Isles sends his deepest regrets." Lyra didn't turn to face him. His deepest regrets, just like the others. Her skin flashed briefly red before returning to a dull blue. What excuse did he give? He mentioned a sudden illness, Princess. Of course. Lyra's laugh held no humor. They all become mysteriously ill when marriage to me is mentioned. It was the 7th refusal this season alone. At 24 cycles, Lyra was well past the traditional age of royal union. The problem wasn't her appearance. With her tall, graceful figure, delicate features, and the most vibrant skin patterns in the royal family for generations, she was considered a great beauty among her people. It wasn't her temperament either. She was kind and intelligent, educated in the finest schools across the 3 systems. No, the problem was the trial. Every royal marriage in Australian history required the suitor to pass the royal trial, a telepathic bonding ritual that tested compatibility and fortitude. For most Australians, forming mental links was a simple matter, a pleasant exchange of surface thoughts and feelings. But the royal bloodline carried stronger abilities, much stronger. The last suitor who attempted the trial with Lyra had collapsed after just 30 seconds, his mind overwhelmed. He recovered, mostly, though he still jumped at shadows and spoke to people who weren't there. The one before him had fallen into a coma for 3 months, and the very first brave soul who had tried to court Lyra had died. His neural pathways burned out by the intensity of her untrained telepathic field. After that, no one dared approach her. "The king and queen request your presence in the throne room," Torrin said, interrupting her thoughts. "The council meeting has begun." Lyra nodded and followed him through the winding crystal corridors of the palace. As she walked, servants and guards bowed respectfully, but she noticed how they avoided direct eye contact. They feared her, just like everyone else. The massive doors to the throne room swung open. Inside, her parents sat on their luminous thrones, surrounded by the council of elders. Their discussion fell silent as she entered. "Daughter, join us." King Orion's voice was gentle but strained. His skin patterns showed worry, flickering between deep purple and gray. Queen Mira looked even more concerned. "We were discussing the Centauri Alliance. Their ambassador has expressed concerns about our commitment without a proper royal union to cement relations." Elder Pax, the oldest and most conservative council member, spoke bluntly. "The kingdom grows weak without alliances. 3 neighboring systems have signed treaties with the Vexari Empire while we delay. We need this marriage, Princess. The future of our people depends on it." Lyra felt the weight of their expectations crushing her. "I cannot force someone to undergo the trial when they know what happened to the others." "Perhaps," suggested Elder Nyx, "we could modify the trial. Make it less demanding." The king shook his head. "The trial has been our way for 10,000 years. It ensures that only the strongest join the royal line." "Then what would you have me do?" Lyra's skin flashed with anger and frustration. "Shall I marry a corpse, or someone whose mind I've destroyed?" "We will find a solution," Queen Mira said, but her tone lacked conviction. As they debated, Captain Gel entered and bowed deeply. "Your Majesties, forgive the interruption. A ship from Earth has entered our orbit. They request permission to send a diplomatic delegation to discuss trade agreements." "Earth?" Elder Pax frowned. "The humans. They're newcomers, barely a century into space travel." "Yes," Gel confirmed. "But their resources are considerable, and they seek new allies." King Orion exchanged a look with his queen. "Very well. Prepare to receive them. Perhaps new blood is exactly what our kingdom needs." Lyra watched her parents with mild interest. The humans were still an unknown quantity in galactic politics, adaptable and resilient, but inexperienced. She had never met one personally. She didn't realize that her life was about to change forever. James Reed straightened his formal diplomatic uniform as the Earth shuttle descended through Australia's pearl-white atmosphere. Out the window, the capital city of Lumen sparkled like a handful of diamonds scattered across dark blue velvet. "Nervous?" asked Captain Miller, the shuttle pilot. "A bit," James admitted. At 32, he was young for his position as Earth's lead diplomat to this sector, but his natural talent for understanding alien cultures had pushed him up the ranks quickly. "This is my first time meeting Australians." "Strange folks," Miller said, adjusting their descent path. "Beautiful, though. Just don't stare at their glowing skin. They consider it rude." James nodded, reviewing what little Earth knew about these people. The Australians were one of the older spacefaring races, respected for their advanced technology and telepathic abilities. They kept mostly to themselves, which made this invitation for trade talks unusual. The shuttle touched down at the Royal Spaceport with barely a bump. James took a deep breath and followed protocol, waiting for the local delegation to approach before exiting. The welcoming committee consisted of 5 Australians, their tall, slender bodies draped in flowing garments that complemented the natural glow of their skin. Their faces were almost human, except for the slightly larger eyes and the patterns of light that pulsed beneath their nearly translucent skin. "Welcome to Australia," said the lead official, his skin glowing a formal gold. "I am Torin, royal advisor to the throne. His Majesty King Orion welcomes you and has arranged a formal reception tonight." "We're honored," James replied, bowing slightly. "I'm James Reed, representing Earth's Interstellar Coalition." As they traveled through the city in a hovering transport, James couldn't help but marvel at the architecture. Buildings that seemed to be grown rather than built, with spiraling towers and bridges that caught the light of the twin moons now rising in the early evening sky. The palace was even more impressive up close. A massive structure that looked like an enormous crystal had been carefully hollowed out and filled with light. "The reception will begin in 2 hours," Torin informed him as they reached the guest quarters. "The royal family will be present. It would be wise to review our customs before then." James smiled. "I've been studying for weeks." After settling in and changing into fresh formal wear, James joined the gathering in the Grand Hall, an enormous room with a ceiling that seemed to capture stars inside crystal. Australians of obvious importance mingled, their skin glowing in various colors that James guessed indicated their mood or status. "Ambassador Reed," Torin appeared at his side. "Allow me to present you to their majesties." James followed the advisor to where the king and queen sat on crystalline thrones. He bowed deeply, just as his briefing had instructed. "Your majesties, I bring greetings from Earth." King Orion nodded, his skin pulsing with royal blue light. "We welcome you, human. Your species is young among the stars, but we have heard promising things." "We look forward to learning about your people," added Queen Mira with a gracious smile. James was about to respond when the room suddenly quieted. He turned to see what had captured everyone's attention. A female Australian had entered through a side door. Unlike the others, whose skin glowed in steady, controlled patterns, hers shimmered with waves of color that seemed to move with her emotions. Right now, a mixture of blue and purple. She moved with natural grace, her head held high despite the way other guests subtly moved away as she passed. "Who is that?" James asked, unable to hide his curiosity. Torin's voice dropped low. "That is Princess Lyra, the king and queen's only daughter." "She's beautiful," James said honestly. Torin gave him a strange look. "Yes, she is, but I would advise caution, Ambassador. The princess is not someone visitors typically approach." But James wasn't really listening. Something about the princess intrigued him, not just her beauty, but the way she stood apart, the way others kept their distance. There was a story there, and if there was one thing James was good at, It was uncovering stories. Without thinking twice, he stepped forward to introduce himself. 3 weeks into the diplomatic mission, James found himself once again in Princess Lyra's company. What had begun as a formal introduction had evolved into regular meetings, ostensibly to discuss cultural exchange, but increasingly personal in nature. Today they walked through the royal gardens, a place where crystal flowers captured sunlight and transformed it into musical notes. Lyra's skin pulsed with a soft pink glow that James had come to recognize as contentment. "So on Earth, you have no telepathic connection at all?" Lyra asked, genuinely curious. "How do you truly know what others feel?" James smiled. "We watch, we listen, we ask. It's imperfect, but there's something beautiful about the effort required to truly understand someone else." "That sounds lonely," Lyra said, her glow dimming slightly. "Sometimes, but maybe not knowing everything creates a different kind of closeness. There's always something new to discover about someone you care about." Lyra stopped beside a fountain that sprayed not water but light into the air. "You're different from the other diplomats we've hosted. They keep formal distance. You ask personal questions. Is that a problem?" James asked. "No," she replied, her skin rippling with blue and gold. "It's refreshing." Across the garden, James noticed Toran watching them with obvious concern. Over the past weeks, he'd observed how everyone, from servants to high officials, maintained careful distance from the princess. When he'd asked why, he'd received only vague answers about royal protocol. "Your people seem afraid of you," James said bluntly. "I can't figure out why." Lyra's skin flashed dark purple before settling into a sad blue. "They have reason to be cautious. Because you're royalty. Because I'm dangerous." She met his eyes directly. "Hasn't anyone told you?" "Told me what?" Before she could answer, King Orion and his advisors approached, deep in conversation about the trade negotiations. They paused when they spotted James and Lyra. "Ambassador Reed," the king called. "Just the person we hoped to find. We've been reviewing your proposal on mineral exchange." James bowed respectfully. "I hope it meets with your approval, Your Majesty. It's promising, but there are concerns about long-term commitment between our peoples." The king's skin pulsed with diplomatic gold. Without formal alliance structures, these agreements remain vulnerable to political shifts. Elder Pax, whom James had come to recognize as the most traditional council member, added, "Historically, we secure important alliances through bonds of marriage between noble houses." The statement hung in the air. James glanced at Lyra, whose skin had gone nearly white with surprise. "Earth doesn't have a nobility system," James said carefully. "But you represent your planet's interests," Queen Mira noted, having joined the group. "Your position carries appropriate status." James suddenly understood what was being suggested. The royal family was hinting at a political marriage, not uncommon in galactic diplomacy, but certainly unexpected in this context. What they didn't realize was how much time he'd spent with Lyra, or how quickly he'd grown to admire her intelligence, her quiet strength, and the loneliness she carried with such dignity. Before he could think better of it, James stepped forward. "If a formal alliance would strengthen relations between our worlds, I would be honored to propose a union." He turned toward Lyra. "With the princess's consent, of course." The garden fell completely silent. Even the crystal flowers seemed to halt their melody. The king's skin flashed with shock, while the queen's hand flew to her mouth. Elder Pax actually stepped backward. Toran rushed forward. "Ambassador Reed, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "Why?" James asked, confused by the extreme reaction. "Is there some reason I shouldn't offer?" Lyra's skin was cycling through colors so rapidly James couldn't interpret them. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. "I accept the proposal." The shock around them intensified. The council members began speaking all at once, their skin flashing with alarm. "Princess, you can't." The trial ruled. "A human couldn't possibly." King Orion raised his hand for silence. His expression was grave as he studied James. "Ambassador Reed, do you understand what you're proposing?" "I believe I do," James said, though he was beginning to suspect he was missing something important. "No," the king said quietly. "I don't think you do." He looked at his daughter with concern. "Lyra, you know this isn't fair to him." Lyra stepped closer to James, her skin now pulsing with determination. "He has the right to try, father, as does anyone who wishes to court me." "Try what?" James asked, looking between them. "The royal trial," Lyra said softly. "The test that all must pass before joining our family." She hesitated. "The test that has killed suitors before." James sat motionless in the private chamber where Torin had escorted him after the garden incident. The walls glowed with soft light that seemed to match his troubled thoughts. The doors slid open and Queen Mira entered, her skin pulsing with concerned violet tones. "Ambassador Reed," she said, taking the seat across from him. "I believe we owe you an explanation." "Yes, Your Majesty," James replied quietly. "I seem to have stepped into something I don't understand." The Queen's expression softened. "Tell me, what do you know of Australian telepathic abilities?" "Only the basics. Your people can share thoughts and feelings through direct contact." "For most Australians, yes, but the royal bloodline carries a much more powerful version of this gift." Her skin darkened to a deep blue. "My daughter's telepathic field is exceptionally strong, even by royal standards." James leaned forward. "And this relates to the trial." The royal trial is a mental bonding ritual that tests compatibility between a royal and their potential mate. The Queen's hands trembled slightly. "For Lyra, this test is dangerous. Her mind overwhelms others." "How dangerous?" James asked, though he suspected he knew the answer from everyone's reactions. 3 suitors have attempted the trial with Lyra. 1 died instantly when their minds connected. His neural pathways simply burned out. The Queen's skin flickered with grief. Another fell into a coma and took months to recover. The 3rd survived but was left with permanent mental damage. James felt a chill run through him. And after that, no one dared approach her. Word spread. She became known as the princess no one could marry. Queen Mira's eyes met his. "Until you." The door opened again, and Lyra entered. Her skin pulsed with anxious green patterns. The Queen nodded respectfully and left them alone. "Now you know," Lyra said, remaining by the door as if giving him space to retreat. "Why didn't you tell me?" James asked. "Would you have spoken to me at all if you knew?" Her skin flashed with vulnerability. "These past weeks, you treated me like a person, not something to fear. I treasured that." James considered her words. "What exactly happens during this trial?" "Our minds join completely. Not just surface thoughts, but deep memories, feelings, even subconscious fears." Lyra crossed the room slowly. "For some reason, my telepathic ability is too strong. It overwhelms other minds, like trying to pour an ocean into a cup. And you think the same would happen to me?" "Everyone does." Lyra's skin now showed swirls of sadness and something like hope. "But you're human. Your brain structure is different from any previous suitor." A knock at the door interrupted them. Torin entered, followed by several grim-faced council members. "Ambassador Reed," Elder Pax said stiffly, "we've prepared paperwork to formally withdraw your proposal without diplomatic incident. Your courage is noted, but this cannot proceed." Elder Nix, whose skin showed kinder colors, added, "No shame will come to either party. We can simply move forward with the trade agreements as planned." James looked between them and Lyra, whose expression had become carefully neutral, though her skin betrayed her disappointment with flashes of dark blue. "What if I still want to try?" James asked. The room fell silent. "That would be unwise," Torin said carefully. "Your brain is not evolved to handle Australian telepathy, let alone a royal connection. The risk is unacceptable." Humans have adapted to countless unacceptable environments throughout our history, James replied. Our brains are remarkably plastic, flexible in ways that might surprise you. This isn't about adaptation. Elder Pax snapped, his skin flaring orange. This is about fundamental biological compatibility. James turned to Lyra. Do you believe it's impossible? She hesitated. I don't know, but I don't want to hurt you. James stood up, decision made. I believe we should at least consider the possibility. Humans have a saying, nothing ventured, nothing gained. And another saying, Tor encountered, fools rush in where angels fear to tread. You've been studying our literature. James smiled slightly. Then you should know we also say, the greatest risk is taking no risk at all. He stepped closer to Lyra, whose skin now pulsed with a mixture of fear and hope. I formally maintain my proposal, James announced, and I request to undergo the royal trial. Focus your thoughts, Ambassador. Imagine a wall around your mind. James sat cross-legged on the floor of the meditation chamber, facing Master Elon, an elderly Australian with pale blue skin that barely glowed anymore. For 5 days now, James had trained in basic mental defense techniques, though Master Elon remained doubtful about his chances. On trotting, James said, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool room. Not hard enough. Master Elon placed a finger on James's temple. A mild telepathic touch brushed against his consciousness. Nothing like what the trial would bring, but enough to make James flinch. Your barriers crumble at the slightest pressure. James opened his eyes in frustration. How am I supposed to learn this in just 2 weeks? Your people develop these skills from childhood. Precisely why this endeavor is foolish. Master Elon stood with a sigh. Rest now. We will continue tomorrow. After the master left, James remained sitting, eyes closed, trying to understand what he was feeling during these sessions. It wasn't exactly like a thought or a feeling, more like a presence brushing against something he'd never been aware of before. The door slid open, and he sensed someone enter. Your determination is admirable, came Lyra's voice, and slightly terrifying. James opened his eyes and smiled. More terrifying than the trial. Different kind of terror. She sat beside him, her skin glowing with gentle concern. The council is in an uproar. Half believe you'll die, half believe you'll go mad. A few hopeful ones think you'll just fail and leave with a terrible headache. And what do you believe? Lyra's skin shifted to a thoughtful purple. I believe there's something different about humans, something I can't quite understand. That makes 2 of us. James stretched his stiff shoulders. I've been studying your physiology, by the way. He reached for a tablet and pulled up diagrams comparing Australian and human neural structures. See here. Your telepathic abilities come from this enlarged section of the brain that processes electromagnetic signals. Humans have something similar, but much smaller and used for different purposes. Lyra studied the diagrams. What are you suggesting? Your people's minds are like specialized communication devices, highly tuned to send and receive thoughts. When your royal telepathy tries to connect, it's too powerful for normal receivers. James pointed to the human brain scan. But humans don't have the same receptors. We might process the signals entirely differently. Either that means you'll be completely immune, Lyra said cautiously, or completely defenseless, James finished. But there's another possibility. What if the human brain interprets telepathic input through entirely different pathways? Not better or worse, just different. A soft knock interrupted them. Dr. Vell, the royal physician, entered with a concerned expression. Ambassador, I've been reviewing your latest scans. He placed another tablet on the floor between them. There's something unusual happening already. The scan showed James's brain lit up with activity in areas that normally remain dormant. Your training with Master Elon is activating neural pathways that humans typically don't use, Dr. Vell explained. Your brain is adapting. That's good, right? James asked. Dr. Vell's skin flickered with uncertainty. Unprecedented would be a better word. We have no way to predict how your brain will respond to the princess's full telepathic field. Later that evening, James stood on a balcony overlooking the Crystal City, lost in thought. Torin joined him, his usually formal demeanor softened by what looked like genuine concern. "The trial date has been set," Torin said quietly. 5 days from now." James nodded. "Thank you for telling me. There's still time to reconsider." Torin added, "No one would think less of you." "I would think less of me," James replied simply. Torin studied him curiously. "May I ask why? Is it diplomatic advantage? Personal ambition?" James watched the twin moons rise over the horizon. "When I first met Princess Lyra, I saw someone surrounded by people, yet completely alone. I understand that feeling." He turned to Torin. "Everyone deserves a chance at connection, even if there's risk involved." Torin's skin pulsed with surprised colors. "You genuinely care for her? Is that so hard to believe?" "For an Australian, perhaps not. But you barely know her." James smiled. "Sometimes you don't need telepathy to recognize a kindred spirit." As Torin left, James returned to his studies with renewed determination. In his quarters, he reviewed everything Earth knew about telepathic species across the galaxy, searching for any insight that might help him survive what was coming. What no one knew was that Princess Lyra was doing the same, desperately looking for a way to protect the first person who had seen her as more than just a dangerous royal curiosity. The ancient chamber deep beneath the Crystal Palace had not been used in years. Its walls were lined with a special material that blocked all telepathic energy from escaping, both for the protection of those outside and to prevent any interference with the sacred ritual. James stood at the entrance, dressed in the traditional white robes provided for the ceremony. His heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained calm. "Last chance to change your mind," King Orion said quietly, his skin pulsing with paternal concern. "I appreciate your worry, Your Majesty," James replied, "but my decision stands." The king nodded gravely. "Then may the stars guide your mind." Inside the chamber, Princess Lyra waited on a raised platform in the center. She too wore ceremonial white, making her skin's nervous purple glow even more striking. Around the circular room stood the Council of Elders, royal physicians, and several attendants ready to intervene if things went catastrophically wrong. James climbed the steps to the platform and stood facing Lyra. "Are you sure?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sure," he said with a reassuring smile. Elder Pax stepped forward, his ancient face solemn. "The royal trial is a bond as old as our civilization. It tests not just compatibility, but the strength to join minds and souls completely." He looked directly at James. "Human, do you understand that once begun, the trial cannot be stopped until completion or failure?" "I understand," James replied. "Then kneel, both of you." James and Lyra knelt facing each other. An attendant placed a thin crystal circlet on each of their heads. "These will help focus the telepathic energy," Dr. Vell explained. "Ambassador, remember your training. Don't fight the connection, but don't surrender completely either." Elder Pax raised his hands. "Let the trial begin." At first, nothing seemed to happen. Then James felt a gentle pressure at the edges of his consciousness, like standing in shallow water as the tide begins to rise. He focused on his breathing, maintaining the mental barriers Master Elon had taught him. Lyra's eyes locked with his, her skin shifting to a deep, concentrated blue. The pressure increased, pushing against his mental defenses from all sides. "Good," came Master Elon's voice from somewhere distant. "Hold steady." Suddenly, the gentle pressure transformed into a tidal wave. James gasped as Lyra's mind crashed into his with overwhelming force. Colors, sounds, and emotions not his own flooded his consciousness. He saw fragments of her memories, childhood fears, royal duties, the crushing loneliness of being feared by everyone around her. "His vital signs are spiking," Dr. Vell called out, his voice sounding miles away. James felt his barriers crumbling. Pain shot through his head as alien thoughts threatened to drown his own. This was what had killed the previous suitors, this unstoppable flood of raw telepathic energy. In desperation, James made a decision that went against everything he'd been taught. Instead of reinforcing his mental barriers, he dropped them completely. What is he doing? Someone shouted in alarm. But James had realized something crucial. Fighting the telepathic current was what caused the damage. The human mind couldn't block Lyra's thoughts, but perhaps it could channel them differently. He opened his mind fully, allowing Lyra's consciousness to flow through him rather than against him. Instead of drowning, he began to swim with the current. And then something unexpected happened. As Lyra's memories and feelings flowed into him, his began flowing into her. Not just surface thoughts, but deep memories. His childhood on Earth, his first view of the stars from space, his wonder at discovering new worlds. Lyra's eyes widened in shock. No one had ever managed to reverse the flow before. The connection between them shifted from one-way invasion to something more balanced, a true bond. Pain still coursed through James's body. His nose began to bleed, and sweat poured down his face. But he held on, neither fighting nor surrendering, but joining. Impossible, Elder Pax whispered, watching their connected auras shift and blend into colors the chamber had never witnessed before. As the trial reached its peak, a blinding light erupted from both their circlets, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When it faded, James and Lyra remained kneeling, foreheads now touching, both trembling from exhaustion. Dr. Vell rushed forward with scanning equipment. He's alive, stressed and experiencing neural shock, but alive. James slowly raised his head, meeting Lyra's astonished gaze. His vision was blurry, his thoughts fragmented, but he managed a weak smile. "Did I pass?" he whispered. Lyra's skin glowed with a color no one in the chamber had ever seen before, a brilliant, joyful golden white that seemed to contain hints of every hue. "You did more than pass," she said softly. "You changed everything." 3 months after the trial, the Crystal Palace hummed with activity. Delegates from 12 star systems had arrived to witness something unprecedented, the union of an Australian royal and a human diplomat. James stood on the balcony of his chambers, adjusting the formal Earth uniform that had been modified with traditional Australian elements. The headaches had finally stopped last week, though occasionally he still felt echoes of thoughts that weren't his own. "Nervous?" asked Captain Miller, who had returned to serve as Earth's official representative at the ceremony. "Strangely, no," James replied with a smile. "I think we've been through the hard part already." The door slid open, and Toran entered, his skin glowing with formal gold and, surprisingly, genuine happiness. "It's time, Ambassador," he said, then corrected himself. "I mean James." As they walked through the palace corridors, James noticed how differently people looked at him now. Where once there had been polite diplomatic distance, now there was curiosity and respect. News of his survival had spread far beyond Australia, turning him into something of a legend among the galactic community. The Great Hall had been transformed for the ceremony. Crystal formations captured and amplified light in patterns that told the history of both worlds. Earth representatives stood on one side, Australian nobility on the other, with delegations from allied systems filling the remaining space. King Orion and Queen Mira greeted James warmly as he took his position at the front of the hall. "You have changed our daughter's life," the Queen said softly, her skin pulsing with maternal affection. "And the future of our people." Before James could respond, the music changed and all eyes turned to the entrance. Princess Lyra appeared, her ceremonial robes flowing like liquid starlight around her. Her skin glowed with a joyful radiance that needed no telepathic bond to interpret. As she approached, James felt a familiar gentle touch at the edges of his mind, the permanent partial bond that remained after the trial. It wasn't the overwhelming flood of the ceremony, but a soft, constant connection that let them sense each other's strongest emotions. Elder Pax, who had been among the most skeptical of the match, now stood ready to perform the ceremony. His ancient face was solemn, but his skin showed colors of wonder and hope. "Today we witness not just a union of two people, but a bridge between worlds," he began. "For 10,000 years, the royal trial has tested worthiness through established patterns. Today we celebrate one who found a new path." The ceremony blended traditions from both cultures. They exchanged vows in both languages, shared symbolic gifts, and finally placed their hands on the ancient crystal that had recorded royal unions since the beginning of their civilization. As their joined hands touched the crystal, it glowed with unprecedented brilliance, capturing the unique signature of their bond. "What was once thought impossible stands before us," Elder Pax announced to the gathered dignitaries. Princess Lyra and James Reed, united in mind and purpose. At the celebration afterward, Dr. Vell approached with the latest findings from their research. "The partial bond you share is stabilizing," he explained excitedly. "Your brains have adapted to each other in ways we never imagined possible. The human neural plasticity combined with Australian telepathy has created something entirely new." "What does that mean for the future?" James asked. "It means," King Orion said, joining their conversation, "that others might follow your path. Already, we've received inquiries from other species about diplomatic exchanges. And more importantly," Lyra added, slipping her hand into James's, "it means we're not alone anymore." Later that evening, they stood together on the highest tower of the palace, watching the twin moons rise over their kingdom. "Did you ever imagine this outcome when you first proposed?" Lyra asked, her skin glowing with contentment. "Not exactly," James admitted with a smile, "though I'm not complaining about the results. The Council is already talking about the implications for interspecies relations throughout the galaxy. They're calling it the human approach, adapting by opening up rather than defending." James laughed. "Not the most creative name." "Perhaps not," Lyra agreed, her expression growing more serious. "But it represents something important. For generations, my people believed safety came from careful barriers and controlled connections. You showed us another way." As the stars appeared above them, ships from various worlds twinkled in orbit, more diplomatic delegations arriving daily, eager to understand this new possibility for connection between different minds. "So what happens now?" James asked, looking out at the future spreading before them like the galaxy itself. Lyra's skin glowed with a beautiful certainty as she turned to face him. "Now we build something new, together."